Thank you, Ira. I appreciate that. And thank you all for being here today. As Ira said, I come to you as a change management practitioner, but I also am incredibly passionate about sustainability. I have an MBA in sustainable management from Presidio School of Management out in San Francisco. So it is my hope that providing this information for you today that I can help you achieve your goals, because what you are doing is so very important to helping us achieve a more sustainable world, which is what all of us are looking for. So I am really thrilled to be here and consider this a privilege to talk with you. So I want to jump into what are just discussion topics and what I'd like to cover today. First, I'd like to talk about the challenge that you have of integrating sustainability into curricula. Then how change management is really considered a value, a leadership tool that provides value inside all kinds of organizations. And then I want to provide you a brief change management overview, talk about the theory of change management. And then I really want to spend some time on, as a practitioner, giving you a few key tools that you can apply in your change initiative, because as much as I love theory as the next person, at the end of the day, we have to provide value. And so hopefully we can apply a few of these key tools to help you achieve your goals. So the key messages here really is that integrating sustainability into curricula, of course, is a significant change to the way that people think, work, and often organize. You, as a change agent, can increase the probability of achieving your goals by leveraging a tool that other organizations use every day to achieve their goals. So corporations, government entities, nonprofits, etc. Change management is the process and a set of tools to manage what we call the people side of change to achieve a desired business outcome. So its success is really contingent upon you customizing. It's a standard set of tools, but it's not one size fits all, because all of you are working inside unique organizations with unique individuals, unique management structure, culture, all kinds of political issues to deal with, etc. So we just have to think about this as a standard set of tools and how do we customize. So the objectives are twofold. First, just providing an overview of change management so that you have this lens of thinking about change management as a methodology, but also a few key tools that could really help you leverage this methodology to get results. And then secondly, it is about leadership, because change is a constant inside our organizations. And so we like to think of this as building an unconscious competency, because every level of leadership in an organization needs to understand change, since change is constant, so that you're constantly applying that lens of thinking about the people issues that you're dealing with so that you can achieve the goals that you set out. And that's certainly critical to what you're doing in your ESD world and in the vision that we have. So with that, I just want to jump into the challenge that we have here. And I just pulled in a couple of slides here using the ASHE 2010 report on sustainability, curriculum, and higher education, a call to action, because I thought this was a perfect way to underscore and illustrate the importance of change management to what you're doing. So here the report says the real challenge we face in embracing a more sustainable future rests with our ability to educate students differently. To do this, of course, will require significant changes in curriculum and pedagogy. This last statement in blue is what I consider to be the most important to illustrate this point of change management. These changes will only occur when large numbers of faculty have the knowledge, the skills, the resources, the support, the incentives, and the disposition and how they teach. So you'll see in a moment when I talk about the Prosci ADKAR model that this aligns beautifully with the ADKAR model, because we think about ADKAR as awareness, desire, knowledge, abilities, and reinforcement. So when you think about every individual faculty member that you are who you're trying to work with needs to have an awareness around what needs to change, why it needs to change. They need to have the desire, the disposition to change. How do we do that? How do we give them the knowledge, the skills? How do we give them the ability, the resources, the support, and then how do we reinforce that through incentives? So that's what we think about when we think about change. So this seems to be a perfect fit. And then from the ASHA report, also, I thought there were a couple good points here in talking about the scale of this challenge in integrating sustainability into college and university curricula. This is significant because when you look across all these institutions, this change is really dependent on millions of faculty members individually changing. And then the third bullet point here I find to be a challenge in all organizations, honestly, because most of the time our organizations are structured in silos. That's the way the work's done. You know, we have a lot of functional silos, discipline silos, and so our new complex challenges we're dealing with when we have to have systems thinking and holistic thinking around how our social systems are embedded in our ecological systems. This requires us to think differently and teach students differently. So we really need to break down those silos, and that is something that change management can help with. So how is change management a valuable leadership tool? First of all, significant curriculum change, large-scale challenge, those words, those can benefit from change management methodology because change management provides proven results with large-scale change. It's been around since the 80s. It provides a framework. I think of this as a lens for thinking through this process of change, this constant lens that we have to look through. Then it provides you a set of tools that you can use to prioritize and optimize your actions. And absolutely is dependent upon you customizing a fit-for-purpose plan based upon your unique institution. Not one size fits all. How do we try to adapt that inside our organization? And certainly it increases the probability of achieving desired outcomes, and that has been proven time and again. And I've pulled in one example here. Prosci is a change management organization, and it's a very popular certification model today, but the organization has done a tremendous amount of work to benchmark change management and provide data-driven change management. And so last year, their benchmarking data showed, as you can see here, that those 245 organizations who said that they did an excellent job of change management, applying change management inside their organizations, 94% of them achieved their goals. Then contrast that with those who said they did a poor job of change management. So it can make a difference if it is done well. So that is the challenge. How do we do this well? So let's first start with what is change management. So we look at this as the disciplined people side of change to achieve a desired outcome. So Prosci defines this here as the discipline that guides how we prepare, equip, and support individuals to successfully adopt change in order to drive a specific organizational outcome. It's both a methodology and it's a flexible set of tools. The methodology is increasingly beneficial. So change management is increasingly beneficial the more that the change impacts the way that people behave. And if you think about the ASHE 2010 report that I just brought up and what you're working with inside your organization, you know that this can be a significant change to the way faculty members function today, the way you work today, whether it's the type of, whether you have these silos and the type of work you're doing is very narrow in its focus, and tomorrow it needs to be much more integrated. So this is a situation in which change management can provide value. There are many different frameworks for change management, and it's one of those situations where you just go pick one, and you will see many thought leaders out there that have been around since the 80s, and individual consulting firms often have their own frameworks, like Chevron have their own proprietary methodologies. But what you will find is that most of them, they're all really based on this common set of principles that are rooted in organizational behavior and human behavior. So if you want to get into the details of that, I would refer you to any of these thought leaders. What I want to talk about today is really the practical application of that knowledge, because that's where we're going to get the results. So I want to just illustrate one of the examples here of one of these thought leaders. So most of these frameworks focus on what, and one of the most popular ones throughout time has been John Cotter's from Harvard. And you'll see here on the bottom left-hand side, this is his 8-step process, and you can see where he says, create a sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition, form strategic vision and initiatives, etc. around the circle. Very valuable in thinking about what do I need to do to create change inside my organization. He also then breaks it down into management activities and leadership activities. As a practitioner, I tend to think that those really blend change management and project management. So I find this very valuable, but I don't find it as helpful as I do the Prosci model. And I've listed here Jeff Hyatt above at Prosci. I really prefer, a lot of us in the practitioner space prefer this model because it focuses not only on the what we need to do, but why we need to do these things. So I want to talk about that for a moment. So Prosci is a popular framework, and I'm going to really leverage that in the discussion today is really the Prosci methodology, and then I'm going to get into my own approach to using tools. But the Prosci methodology is valuable in that it differentiates project management from change management, and it differentiates organizational change from individual change. And so we'll spend a little time on this illustration. So in the middle of this illustration, you will see the red, yellow, green. So if you think about current state, where we are today in the red, and we want to move to future state, well, the middle state, transition. How do we transition to that future state? It's going to require 2 different approaches. There's the project management side, which is the technical side, and then there is the change management approach, which is the people side. We have to have both of those. They're complementary. And if you think about, let's just take an example, the technical side of change. So when you are developing new courses and new case studies, and you're trying to build a new coalition for how you work together with other faculty members, the technical side of getting that work done is project management. But all of the people issues that overlay that are change management issues. And so we have to be mindful of both. So from a project management side, we're thinking about we initiate the project, we plan it, we execute it, monitor it, and move through closing. And we're thinking about things like our resources, our budget, our schedule, our tracking. Those are the types of things you think about from a project standpoint. From a change management side, we are thinking about 2 levels of change, dealing specifically with people issues. First, there's the organizational level, preparing for change, managing change, reinforcing change, and there are a number of tools that are available to help with organizational change. That is the what we are doing to create this transition to future state. These are the things we need to do to move us from current state to future state. But then underneath that is the individual change, the ADKAR model, which is a Prosci model that is the awareness, desire, knowledge, abilities, and reinforcement. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But that's important to be mindful of both of those levels, organizational and individual. So the reason being is that the organizational change is a collective result of the individual change. So let's use as an example here at an organizational level. Let's say current state, your curriculum is developed by discipline. Future state, you want to have sustainability fully integrated into an interdisciplinary curriculum. So that organizational change is going to be dependent upon each individual that is going to be impacted by that change. So all those faculty members, how they do their jobs today, how different will that be in the future state? And so we have to be thinking about both of those levels. Prosci looks at this as 5 tenets of change, that we change for a reason. Organization change, of course, requires individual change. That our outcomes are the collective result of individual change. Change management is our enabling framework for the people side, and that we apply this framework to help us realize our desired outcomes. So on the bottom half of this slide is really those points illustrated. If you look at the bottom right-hand side, that is ideal state. If you think about each one of those green boxes as being the faculty members that you need, and all the other stakeholders that you need to move from current state to future state, that is the ideal state. We will have moved each one of those individuals. If we don't think about them, if we do not support and equip those individual transitions, then our future state might look like what's on the bottom left-hand side, which is, of course, half of our faculty members and other stakeholders moving to that future state, because we didn't think about that ADCAR process for each of the individuals. So obviously, logically, if we only move part of our stakeholders to future state, we're not going to get the return on investment that we expected. We're not going to realize the benefits and meet our expectations. So we need to think about each of those individuals. Now, the caveat here is, realistically, as a practitioner, I can say to you that bottom right-hand side, the ideal state, is an ideal state. In most cases, we do not move everybody. That's just human nature. Resistance to change is natural. It's something we should anticipate. We should try to neutralize. We should try to mitigate it. But there are just some instances where we're not going to get those people to move, and we have to accept that. But we know that if we apply change management methodology to our change, that we can really seek to move as many people as possible under the circumstances. So that should be our goal, is to get as close to the ideal state as possible. Now, ADCAR model. This is what is underlying the collective change, is an individuals moving through this sequential process. This is something to always be mindful of. We first have to start with awareness. People need to be aware of the need for change, the nature of the change. What are the risks of not changing? Then, once they're aware, we need to connect with them on desire. And when you look at change management literature, this is often called the what's in it for me, or the WIPM. So I wanted to make you familiar with that terminology if you're not already, because this is really one of the sticking points, is connecting with people on desire. You want them to want to change. You want them to support the change. You want them to participate and engage in the change. You don't want them to attempt to move because they feel like they have to change, because that's not going to stick. It's very difficult to sustain that. So how do we connect with that desire? What's in it for me? And once you get through that stage, then you can build the knowledge on how to change, how to implement new skills and behaviors, then work on the ability to implement the change, to give them the support that they need to implement the change and demonstrate performance. And Prosci would say at this point that you've met your short-term objectives. Once you've given people the ability, you've reached that fourth stage there, and you would, meet the objectives that you set out to. But that's in the short term. For the longer term, you need to reinforce, because you want to sustain the change and you want to build a culture and competence around that change. So this is the process you should always be mindful of for individuals. Then in an organizational level, so when I said there was the organizational change level, and I do apologize, this is a very text-heavy slide, so we can ask questions if this is a little too much, but I want to spend a little time on this, because Prosci looks at this as 3 phases of change. We start with the preparation, then we manage, then we reinforce. I put below their blue phases here, I put my bullet points below, because these are the things I do as a practitioner when I am working through these stages. I make sure in phase 1 that if, from a project perspective, if the vision and business case have not already, and the scope and the measures have not already been put in place, I work to help put them in place. And certainly if they are in place, I help validate that. So that needs to be part of the change process, is at least validating that all of those are what they need to be. Then I conduct a stakeholder analysis, which is critical, and we're going to talk about that. And assess sponsor support. In change management terminology, when we say sponsor, we're talking about management, people with authority to help us with the change. And so I would assess sponsor support and their competency to be sponsors and to help us. Then I assess readiness, and then use that information to assemble a team. Then in the managing phase, it's putting together a communications plan, a training and coaching plan, a sponsor roadmap to help build sponsor competency and support. and then plans to manage resistance. And then in that last phase, this is about where we're monitoring, we're celebrating successes, we're reviewing where we have issues and trying to identify the root causes of our issues and creating plans to address those issues, and then creating this transition plan to help us sustain for that longer term oversight and that longer term culture. The whole point of this process, I look at this as sort of a strengths and weaknesses, like you would do a SWOT analysis. I think change management planning is a great opportunity to look at the strengths and weaknesses of your change so that you can take a step back, look overall and say, what do I have working in my favor? What's working against me? How can I strengthen what I have? How can I minimize the negative? Because as I've got here on the left-hand side in red, this good change leadership, you're looking at the change, the scope of it, what you're trying to accomplish. You look at your team, you look at the management sponsorship that you have to help you create that change, and you're asking yourself, do I have the right ingredients to succeed? Because if you don't, then we need to scale back the change, or we need to put a plan in place to enhance sponsorship so that we get more management support on our side to remove some barriers, or we adjust our team. Maybe we find out in our planning process that we've got some really important stakeholders that we hadn't thought about, and we need to bring some of those representatives onto our team to help us create the change. So our goal here is really to be leveraging our key influencers, whether they're people on the front line with us or whether they're managers who support what we're doing, and then match that sponsorship with the scope of the change. And you can always start small and scale up, but we always want to be looking at big picture because we want to design with the end in mind and figure out how are we going to get there, what's the best approach to get there. So this planning is going to be influenced by the type of change that you have. For me, it is in the corporate world, we have often a top-down mandate. For you, I'm assuming as a faculty member, and from what I heard at the ASHE conference last year in Baltimore, a lot of what's being done by faculty members are grassroots efforts. And so that's a great way to start as well. But whether you start top down or whether you start bottom up, ultimately, if you've got any sizable change at all in an organization, you're going to need a combined top-down, bottom-up. That is the ideal state. So we need to be planning for that top-down, bottom-up for some future point, even if you're starting as grassroots. So let me walk through each of these. So top-down, of course, the pros are that you've got change aligned with the leadership vision. You've got the authority that you need for the change, the power, the resources, the ability to knock down barriers. The cons, and I see this a lot, is that you get potential resistance because people feel, oh no, not another change. We deal with this all the time. We've got management great ideas and they're out of touch with what really needs to happen on the front line. That's not going to work. I hear this so much. That's not going to work in our day-to-day work environment. So you get that not invented here. Not a great idea. So when I'm handed a top-down mandate, I am immediately thinking about how do I build a grassroots coalition so that we can meet in the middle. And that, of course, is that right-hand side of combined ideal state. For you starting bottom up, if that's what you're doing, the pros there is that you are dealing with frontline people, so faculty members who want to change. And you've got knowledge and the desire in most cases to create the most effective solutions. You're in touch with the day-to-day reality, what the students need, what the issues are that you need to be addressing holistically from a systems thinking perspective, that you've got the knowledge to create the most effective solution to the challenges that we have. So those are the pros. The cons are when you start dealing with a sizable change and you've got numerous departments or numerous colleges involved, you lack the broad authority and the ability to remove barriers that are just a fact of life that we have to deal with. There are structural barriers, there are budget barriers, there are incentive barriers, there are political barriers. And those are the places where we need management, the people who have the authority, whomever they might be in your organization, to help us create the change. So we need to be planning for that combined ideal state, because when you're in that ideal state, you've got leadership at all levels, you've got change at the bottom that's aligned with the leadership vision at the top, you've got the authority for change, and you've got a front line who not only wants to, but in many cases are very passionate about the change and can help create the most effective solution. Now, can you still hear me, Ira?
Yes, you're okay.
Okay, just wanted to make sure you all could still hear me. Okay, so the con in this situation, in my opinion as a practitioner, is this requires more rigor in the structure and the process. And I say this because it's more about many moving parts. You've got many moving parts, and so we have to try to weave all of this together, and it requires a great deal of planning and coordination. And so when you get to grassroots, can be a little bit more loosely structured initially, but when you want to try to get that top-down push, you're going to have to weave together all the efforts on the front line with what's desired from management. So that is going to take planning and coordination. So that's why I think the tools will help you think about how can you really plan and coordinate to achieve that top-down, bottom-up success, because that's ultimately where you'll need to go. So this is what I do. When I sit down with a new change initiative, I start with the strategic goals and the measures for my organization at every level. So for you, sit down, get your strategic goals measures for your university, college, department, and discipline, because we're going to want to tie all of those together the best we can. And then get an internal, external stakeholder list and your org chart for the institution. And you're going to use those to develop your initial vision, business case, and measures if they're not already in place, or to validate them. And then create a stakeholder analysis and sponsor assessment, and then the communications training and coaching plan for your stakeholder groups, and then a sponsor roadmap, which is much like a communications training and coaching plan specifically for management. And when you do all of that, that's when you do that assessment of, do I have the right ingredients to succeed? And if not, that's when you begin adjusting. But it's helping you from a planning standpoint. So I've included in here just a stakeholder list from UT Arlington. This is not curriculum specific, but this is just for their Institute for Sustainability and Global Impact. I included it just as an illustration of think about your stakeholders very broadly, cast the net very broadly. Who do you need as a stakeholder to help you achieve the vision that you have set out for yourself or for your team? What internal stakeholders, what external stakeholders, what partnerships and collaborations? And think about this from when you do a stakeholder analysis, you're including people who just need to be kept in the loop. But most importantly, you need those people who need to be consulted, who will own it. So I think about a RACI diagram in my mind. I think about who will be responsible for this change, who will be accountable for this change. Those are the stakeholders I absolutely want involved, and who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. And I include all of those stakeholders in a stakeholder analysis. And so this is what I would recommend, is that you open an Excel spreadsheet, and on one tab put a stakeholder analysis, on a second tab put your communications training and coaching plan, and include all of your stakeholder groups, and make those groups as granular as you need, depending on how if they behave differently, then make them as granular as you need to reflect their behavior. I would not take this down to the individual level. And as a matter of fact, because both of these documents, or both of these plans, I typically share with larger audiences, so with my team, with management, etc., I highly discourage putting any individual names in these documents other than your key influencers and the people who are going to be delivering your presentations, etc. But as far as from a negative standpoint, I would keep potential resistors and that type of thing at a group level, but be very mindful of the individuals in your head, just because that's very sensitive information and you do not want to create more harm than good. So in a stakeholder analysis, we want to be thinking broadly. We want to be thinking about how these stakeholder groups behave. So you put them in your first column as a stakeholder. Then in the second column, you think about what is their impact on this vision of change, with one being little influence or little power over the project outcomes, two being some influence, three being moderate, four being major influence, and five being without this stakeholder, this project is doomed to failure. That's pretty significant, because if you need that stakeholder to make this a success, period, then we need to make sure the next column that we move these people to a 4 or a 5, because in your level of support column, you'll want to do an initial assessment, and then you'll want to keep this in mind as you move through the change of how you're moving the needle, because one is going to be a negative support, like actively or subversively working against you. Two, a moderately negative, maybe passive resistance. Three is neutral. Four is moderately positive, and five is an active supporter. So so this is important, because when you look at these stakeholders and say, I've got a 5 stakeholder that we're going to be doomed to failure without them, but they are a 2 on level of support, that's a problem. And that is a problem that we need to address. And how are we going to address them? So this is really just a logical process of working through your stakeholders and prioritizing the stakeholders and prioritizing actions depending upon their level of support, where they are, and how we need to move the needle. So in the next column, you think about ADKAR barriers. So if we think about that sequential process, where are they? Are they aware of the need for the change? If they're not even aware of what you're doing and why you need to do it, we need to start there. We don't start with knowledge and abilities, we start with awareness. So that's just to help, again, to help us be mindful of where we are in the change process from an ADKAR perspective. That next column is the WIFM, what's in it for me. So for each of these stakeholder groups, you're thinking about, what do these people need to be successful? What would they consider a win? How can we connect with them on desire? That's the WIFM. And that is the information and the thinking you need to pull into your communications and training and coaching. And that's why you see the red arrows going down into that communications plan, is because we need to be mindful of what they need from us, because we're trying to help them be successful. Then in the next column of the stakeholder analysis is how will we engage, just at a general level. And then key influencers. And it's very, very important to think about your key influencers. If I've got stakeholder groups that are a level 5 impact, I need to know my key influencers. Who has the most influence in those groups? Because I need to address them. If they're, like for you, a faculty member, they need to come down into your communications training and coaching plan. If it's a manager, a department head, a college dean, someone who can help at that level, then I need to address that in the sponsor roadmap. I need my key influencers working with me, and I need to help them work through the ADKAR process themselves so that they can be the greatest champions, sort of an extension of this core team to help create this change. So I always want to identify key influencers and address that. Then in the last column, just address your potential barriers that you can anticipate, some potential resistance. If there are structural issues, incentive issues, those are the types of things that you should capture, because that is something that will need to be addressed with management and with your sponsorship. And then if you have some subgroups within this stakeholder group, that is sort of a logical, natural resistance to the change. For instance, I put in here textbook authors of neoclassical economics. So if I've got, if those faculty members have written textbooks on neoclassical economics and they see that it's conflicting with ecological economics or environmental economics, then naturally there will be some resistance there. So how am I going to address that? That's just helping me be mindful of those issues. Then in the communications training and coaching plan, this is really just built off of your stakeholder analysis. And you will think first about your key influencers, because as I just mentioned, you want those key influencers to be your greatest champions for this change. And I want to give you an example. So in a project I worked on, which was a major R&D change in an organization that affected over 33 business units, the first thing we did was identify the managers and the key influencers of all of those business units. And then we spent at least a year working with them in advance. So granted, this is going to vary from one organization to the next and the type of change you're trying to implement, et cetera. But this is just an example of how we worked with the key influencers first. We went out to them with our vision, our scope, our business case, our WIFM. We got their input on, are we on the right track? This is the timeline we're thinking about. This is what we're thinking about as far as piloting. Give us your input on that. We vetted with them the process. We vetted with them the timeline. We vetted with them some of the work product and got their input on work product. And then we set them up as our extended team members so that they were the ones out really presenting in their business units, because they had the credibility in the business unit. We didn't, but they had the credibility in the business units. We wanted them to be the communicators. They couldn't do that until we prepared them, until we engaged them and worked them through the ADKAR process, gave them the awareness, connected with them on the desire, and built their knowledge and abilities to help us. So focus on your key influencers first, then think about how you can leverage those key influencers to be your communicators, to be sort of the tentacles out, your extended team out into these different areas that you're trying to help you achieve the change. Now, just one note here, again, I said about the keeping names out of this. Your sponsors, we are going to assess, I'm going to talk about that next. We will try to keep this as innocuous as possible in these documents because we're going to share these broadly. But when you get into your sponsor assessment, which is very similar to your stakeholder analysis, this is something you will lock down. I put this at the bottom. Sensitive information, keep private. This is because you're doing this individual by individual, you will want to keep this to yourself and possibly to a primary sponsor. So let's talk about sponsorship. So again, as I said earlier, in change management, we think about managers, people with authority to break down barriers as our sponsors. You will look at your stakeholder analysis and all the groups that you included from inside your organization and think about who are all the managers who have direct control or influence over those groups that are important to this change, and those are your sponsors. And so you would list them out and you would assess how supportive of the change. Do they support it, or are they neutral or opposed? And then you assess their sponsorship competency. To be a sponsor, you're going to need them to help you champion the change. So we assess how competent are they to perform 3 key sponsorship responsibilities. You need them to participate actively and visibly. You need them to build a coalition of sponsorship with peers and managers, and you need them to communicate constantly. And so that's going to be especially important for you to have that type of leadership when you're talking about department heads or the people who have direct authority over the faculty members you're trying to work with to create this change. You really need that level involved in participating in this and helping you build a coalition and helping you communicate with all those faculty members. So you're assessing this up front so that you can then build a sponsor roadmap, which is just another way in my mind of saying a communications training and coaching plan, but specifically for managers, how you're going to strengthen their sponsor support and their competencies to be a sponsor. And you're going to have to help work them through this ADKAR process. Managers have to be worked through the ADKAR process as well. And you want in this roadmap to also include how you're going to prepare them to help you manage resistance and overcome barriers that are just going to come up as a natural part of the change process, those political barriers, structural barriers, incentives, and budget. So with that, since I've talked about those tools, I want to just stop for a moment and see, Ira, if there are any questions about the tools specifically before I move forward, because that's a lot of information.
Yes, there are a number of questions and comments, and I'll limit it to two questions that relate to the tools and the process that you introduced. Jill is asking, do you really need to wait for phase 3 to reinforce? If you have some early successes, shouldn't you celebrate them?
Yes. So, you know what? I will talk about that when I get to tying it all together, which is coming up in a couple of slides. If we can just defer that for a moment.
Okay.
But the answer is yes.
I've got a couple here that I would like to defer to the end because they are good concluding questions. But the one that relates to what you just presented, Becki is asking, Donna is asking Becki, how often would you revise a stakeholder analysis in order to understand if your interventions are being effective?
That's a great question. And it varies because, quite frankly, if you've got a large change, you can have a large stakeholder analysis, and it can be time consuming to be twiddling around in a document all the time. But I say update it as often as you need to. Of course, this is a great consultant answer, isn't it? It depends. You update it as often as you need, especially in the early phases of the implementation, to see how you're moving the needle. So once you start with your implementation, hopefully you're moving people through the ADCAR process so that we are moving them in their level of support. Because that's really what we want to be doing, is looking at how we're moving them in their level of support and where they are in the ADCAR process. And that really is going to be based upon your needs. There are times when in my mind, I'm updating it, but because I've got constrained time and resources, then I officially sit down and update it with a sponsor, with our program manager, in those types of situations when we go into each project phase or a mid-phase project review. So honestly, there are times when you're so time constrained that you're really keeping a running tab in your head of a lot of these things, but you should update the document on an ongoing basis, especially in the initial phases of implementation when you're doing pilots or your first rollout, to update how you're moving the needle on support and the ADCAR process, and if you've gained some new key influencers that you need to bring into your communications process. So it's not an exact answer, but again, it's one of those things that is going to depend. And so you use your best judgment. Do not feel like that you have to spend all your time in updating documentation. I think that's a little scary to some people, and they, oh my gosh, you've got all of this documentation. It's going to take so much time to do that. I would say focus on the doing and be mindful in your head of how things are changing. And when you have the time to sit down and update the documents, I would sit down and update the documents. The focus
Becki,
is on the doing.
there's a quick follow-up from Jill. Seems like a lot to do from the bottom up if you have no budget and no staff. The spreadsheet seems particularly daunting. Is there a light option?
Well, so yes, change management takes time, and it does not have to be burdensome. I say it does not have to be elaborate, it does not have to be burdensome, but it has to be constant in how you think about change. And as I just talked about with updating documents and creating spreadsheets, I believe there's tremendous value, and I have witnessed that there is tremendous value in making the initial planning, using a spreadsheet to do your initial planning. And if from there out you have to do most of the stuff in your head, then do most of it in your head. But it's just an awareness raising when you sit down and work through the tools to help you think about the change. Yes, this is all logical, but when you start putting it into a document, you start thinking, oh yeah, well, I could do that. And it just starts raising issues for you. So if you have limited time and limited budget, try to carve out enough time to sit down with these 4 tools initially, and then only update them as you have time to from there forward. But I think you will find in the process of creating these documents that it helps you take a bigger picture perspective and helps you prioritize. And that is important, because you could be using a shotgun approach and wasting a lot of time later on without the right planning. So it's like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure type of thought. So that's how I would argue it. So do you want to move on?
Yeah, Becki, you can move on at this point, and we'll get to the remaining questions and comments at the end.
Okay. So one last one over here in red, number 2. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about sponsorship today. I'm hoping at our workshop in this June conference in change management, we will have more time to talk about sponsorship, because quite frankly, the number one reason that big changes fail are due to sponsorship. That is, the number one reason is due to sponsorship. So we really need to be thinking about all of the sponsors who affect the change, but who is our primary sponsor also, who helps us on a day-to-day basis as a core team trying to get this work done? Who is our biggest champion that has the scope of authority over this change? And when you sit down and you do this stakeholder analysis and your sponsor assessment and you create your plans, even if, like I said, if it's just a one-time deal that you have the time to do, please do it, because in doing so, it helps you think about that big picture. It helps you to inform all of the other decisions that you need to make. When you look at how big is my scope, who all is impacted by this change, well, therefore, I'm able to think about, well, who needs to be represented on the team? What would be the best team structure? Do I need a steering committee because I've got a lot of people out on the perimeter here who need to be consulted, and so I need to have a way to keep them engaged and giving input? Because quite frankly, if you start small, say you do a certificate program or you do some sort of pilot that's small, but then you start trying to phase that into something bigger, you could get down the road and have these other stakeholders who were not involved up front push back on you. That's just like the example with the 33 business units. If we had started with 1 business unit or 2 business units, the other 30 would have gone screaming in the other direction if we had not involved them from the outset in trying to craft the best solution. And granted, in some cases, their solution at their business unit was slightly different, but they felt like they were all working together. And so that, to me, is the most important value. So for the question that came about, do I have to do the spreadsheet? I just think it's a valuable thought process, because you're able to look at that big picture and look at issues of who are my most important stakeholders, what type of team should I have, what managers should I engage early on and get them involved to help us. And so I can't spend a lot of time on team today. We don't have the time, but we can talk about that in workshop, because this is so unique to the change that you're trying to implement. But it's certainly something that is informed by your stakeholder analysis and your sponsor assessment. So I highly encourage you to do those things. And then we tie it together. So the question earlier about reinforcing the change. So I look at this as an overlay of change management people issues with the project management technical side of change. So each of these phases of change, very important to the project side as well. They are complementary. They have to work together. In your initiation phase of your project, when you do your preparing for change in phase 1, the blue box of phase 1, when you are validating what's happening in the project, you are using your change management work to inform the technical side of the work. For instance, you use your stakeholder analysis and your sponsor assessment to inform your scope selection. How big is this going to be? How big can we make it? How do we phase it? What timeline are we looking at? What should our team structure look like? What are our risks and issues? you can start this process up front. And if you want to start, when you look at your stakeholder analysis and your sponsor assessment, if you see a lot of 5-level stakeholders with a 1 or a 2 level of support, and when you put your plan together for communicating and your sponsor roadmap, and you're thinking, this is going to be an incredible challenge to bring all of these people on board for something big, like a big interdisciplinary change. So you would use that to say, well, let's start small. Let's start small with a pilot effort with those champions who are the most favorable to this change. But let's create a process and a team that representatives from these other stakeholder groups and get them involved from the outset to sort of monitor this pilot process and give their input in this pilot process so that we can begin building their awareness and desire. And that goes to the question of reinforcing change. So when you get successes from that pilot process, absolutely you're going to be communicating it. And you're going to be trying to gain the buy-in using those successes with your other stakeholder groups. So that's why I think this planning process up front is so important to inform your technical side of change in this initiation stage and in the planning stage. When you get to actually executing, which is you start your pilot, then yes, that's where you're going to start reinforcing. So that question that was just raised about can't we celebrate success? Yes, reinforcing starts when you start executing. As soon as you're getting wins, as soon as you're making progress, you are celebrating, you are reporting on your measures, you are reporting, you're being transparent about what the issues are, get people's involvement and engagement on how you address those issues. We would always report issues inside our change initiative to management, to our stakeholders, and get their input on how do we address them. We're trying to be transparent and get everyone involved in creating the right solutions. And then in that last part of reinforcing the change, of course, as you go through executing and monitoring, then you have to think about how you sustain it and embed it in the DNA and reinforce the culture. So these two approaches are complementary, and we should think of them that way. One, the change management certainly helps the project management side of things. So I'd like to conclude on just a summary of what I've stated in the presentation from a practitioner's perspective, that I have witnessed the change management making a big difference to achieving desired outcomes, where people behavior is needed, the change is needed inside organizations. Just to constantly, as I said, this doesn't have to be elaborate. We can keep it as simple as we possibly can. Still going to take some time, but let's focus on keeping it simple. But it has to be constant. It is a lens. It is a mindset. It is that unconscious competency that I was talking about as a leadership tool, to be able to think about the people side of change at all times. So you use that framework of thinking about project management and change management, how they work together, and then the ADKAR process, how individuals move through change, and then use tools to logically think about and work through the planning and implementation process. So align change with your institution vision and goals, because you want to align from the top all the way down, or down all the way to the top. The more aligned you can get those goals, the more you're going to have your management sponsorship on board. And you always prepare to design with the end in mind. If you're going to start small but scale up, you've got to figure out a way to get that larger audience stakeholder groups involved. Then conduct that stakeholder analysis and that sponsor assessment. You've got to understand the people issues so that you can be mindful of them. It informs everything you do within the technical side of change. You're thinking about their level of support, their areas of resistance, so that you can manage that, your key influencers, so you can leverage them. And then you use that to inform all your actions. You build a credible representative team and governance structure because you're trying to think about top-down change. How do we identify our primary sponsor who's going to help us on a regular basis to create change, and then a governance structure to oversee all of this change so that we have constant reviews and input and reinforcement. It's what I talked about earlier about that constant alignment and coordination when you get top down and bottom up. I think about that sometimes like people who are in a caterpillar costume. You know, you have to have everybody in lockstep in the caterpillar costume. And it takes a lot of coordination to do that when you've got many moving parts. And so that's what we need to be thinking about in change management. How do we get this alignment? Top-down change and then bottom-up change. You want team members who own the change. You want team members that represent all your key stakeholder groups. You want team members who are credible with their peers because they're going to be your champions. You want those people with the organizational knowledge and people skills who can understand the change issues and what you're trying to accomplish. Then if it's a really large change, I would define and document roles and expectations because you want everybody on the same page, understanding what you're trying to accomplish and who's responsible for what. And if you've got a large change, you want to think about how you can work with a core team and then coordinate with extended team members. Then engage and communicate continuously. To me, this is at least half of what we do in the change management world is we're always engaging. I spend over half my time engaging with people. And I plan through my communications planning and my sponsor roadmap to constantly engage my stakeholders and certainly focusing on mid-level managers, people I need to help me with the front line. How do I build their support and their competency to help me as champions? Because we're trying to get that top-down, bottom-up change, thinking about ADKAR constantly. Use face-to-face communications wherever you can. We all know that that's pretty logical, but it's critical. Get people's input, act on it, gain their buy-in, constantly work on that. And then document a standard set of talking points. Use a website if you can, just for your internal team. So the what, the why, the when, the how, the with them, all of those things are there for people to access when they're interested in it. And have a standard set of slides that you can use and that your champions can use in talking about what you're trying to change and why and what it means for people in your organization. And then constantly communicate your progress and celebrate success. Recognize people for their role, for their help, because that's how we continue to build our network of champions. And then lastly, share best practices and learnings with others, like through SCC, with this community. Although each of you is dealing with a unique set of circumstances, there are a lot of commonalities, and by sharing, we help each other get to our goals much more quickly. So I'm a big proponent of that. So with that, I will end and open it for questions. And Ira said, you said there are a few questions that are general.
Yeah, well, a couple of specific ones. First one brings us back to sponsor assessment, and I know you want to hold that for the June workshop to get into more detail, but let's take a shot at this specific question. You mentioned how the sponsor may help you manage resistance. Is it wrong to switch this around to how you help managers deal with resistors? More like a coaching perspective. The question is probably who owns the problem, the resistor and the change management consultant, or the manager?
So resistance is a very complicated area because it's just natural human behavior. And in our sponsor roadmap, we are trying to prepare sponsors to manage the resistance, because if you're a change management consultant, you have no authority over those resistors, right? The people with the authority are the ones who are really responsible for managing that resistance. So we, as the change management champions, need to be preparing the sponsors to do that. They need to understand the ADKAR process in general, and that resistance is natural. And here are some reasons for resistance, and here are some ways to address that resistance. And so we need to prepare them. It's kind of like coaching the manager to help them be more successful in dealing with the resistance. But it really should come from the managers because you need that authority.
So the other one that I have for you, Becki, and I'll just say ahead of time, if you'd like to take a shot at it when I finish reading it, that's great. I can also say that it looks like something that might add another perspective to the June workshop, but this comment and question comes from one of our SCC Advisory Council members, Matt Polsky. He says, I see the value, including the insights and making the often overlooked critical human element front and center, but don't see the space for asking what's unique and or special about sustainability. I don't see innovation, non-linearities and tipping points, ecosystems and our dependence on them, pervasive uncertainties, planning while being sensitive to the planning fallacy, developing and learning the path when you barely understand the lay of the land ahead, changing social expectations. I'd like to think that change management can accommodate something as fundamentally unique as sustainability. Your reaction, Becki?
So I'm trying to think about that on two levels. So one, there is a technical side to that is just the holistic, whole system thinking perspective that is the technical side of sustainability, right? Trying to break down silos and integrate the substantive matter that you're trying to teach. And so that to me is a technical side of curriculum change. From a change management perspective and thinking about how this affects people, I would say there is the issue of how people think and sort of the narrow way. We've been taught to think in specialties rather than in holistic systems thinking, and I think that's true. I can certainly say from the business world perspective, that is very true. And it's an enormous challenge because we have built a culture of specialties. And I think Lester Brown said it well when he said, when I went to college, I had to patch together all of these courses to give me a generalist perspective because all of the plans for the curriculum and the approach inside the university setting was a specialist approach. And he said, so I had to really come at it from my own personal desire to have a bigger picture perspective. And I think that's very true in our world today. We've got a very mechanistic, siloed specialist approach, and we have very few generalists. And in change management, I guess I would argue that change management is a more generalist approach because it is looking holistically at people and how people change is incredibly important to technical change, and that we need to marry all of those pieces together so that it's more holistic. So I would say, yes, there is a challenge there from a change management side. And if you marry change management and sustainability, I would say that where I would focus is how you would change the way that people think, make more generalists. And I think I heard that at the ASHE conference in the business colloquium. We had a speaker talk about how today in the business world he would like to see business specialists who are schooled in sustainability generalist concepts. And that's exactly what we need to be thinking about. I would say a sustainability generalist would understand change management as well, because as I said in the beginning of this presentation, change is a constant, and we need to be thinking about what change is made up of, right? And what is required for change. So that would be my answer to that question. And so if there are suggestions about how you want me to embed sustainability specifically into the workshop in June, I'll entertain those ideas. I welcome that.
Well, that was a great answer without any forethought. And I agree with you, Becki, that it's a comment and question that needs to be taken at multiple levels. And I also agree that looking at it as the distinction between change management at the programmatic level and change management at the societal level, further exploring what change management concepts and approaches might translate between those two levels might be something interesting to take a further look at the conference, and maybe we can recruit Professor Prosci to join us for that discussion.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think when I think about sustainability, I often think about change management, because I think about societally when we think about how people view the world today, which of course I would say we need an enormous paradigm shift. And if you're going to have an enormous paradigm shift, you're talking about an enormous human change. And when I think about the awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement, from that standpoint, I get a little frightened because we're so stuck on awareness. Think about all the people who deny climate change right there. That's an awareness problem. And we're not connecting with people on desire because we can't get them off of awareness. And so that, this anti-science mentality, we could just go on and on about that, but I think about change management all the time when I think about sustainability. This is an enormous people change challenge. And how do we overcome that when we don't have the top-down push, right? Because if you think about it from a top-down, bottom-up, then the top-down push should come from government policy, from university, right? So you think about all the key players, the key stakeholders for a top-down push. I would say we start looking at your pillars. Government's going to be one of them. University is going to be one of them. Media will be one of them, all right? You start thinking through all your stakeholders right there. You think about governments failing in the U.S. right now, and or maybe failing is too harsh of a word, but it's certainly not where we want it to be. And then when I think about universities, you all are trying to change that. So I'm hopeful that just this conversation today, the workshop in June, we can help you start changing things within your university setting. So as one of the key stakeholders for the larger societal change, you will be able to function well at that level to help us create change as one of the key. You'll be one of the greatest champions for change, because if you think about how would you create a more sustainable world, our students need to have the awareness, knowledge, right? The awareness, desire, the knowledge and ability to be problem solvers for all of the challenges that we have today with limited resources and biodiversity loss and climate change, et cetera, et cetera. We need to provide them the knowledge and abilities, and that's what you're trying to work on. So I see this change affecting every level, and I could talk about that forever, and I'm sure you don't want to hear that. but yes, I agree it's something we should talk about in the June workshop.
Well, Becki, with that, I think that's a good place for us to begin to wrap up here. I want to express our appreciation at SCC for your great presentation and insights today, and we look forward to continuing that conversation as we've been alluding to in the June conference, where you will be playing a part. I'm also wanting to react before we lose anybody on the line. A number of people have posted in the chat box saying that they missed my opening remarks in the first 5 minutes, and rather than repeat all of that, I will say www.curriculumforsustainability.org is the SCC Sustainability Curriculum Consortium website. There you will find the information about our various work streams, in other words, our webinars, our planned master classes, and our deeper dive online cohorts. You will also find information about SCC's advisory services for new and existing sustainability programs, cutting across our 3 themes: pedagogy, content, and leadership. And finally, what I announced in the opening minutes of this webinar, with the official announcement coming in the next few days, the SCC Faculty Conference will occur in Philadelphia on June 26th to 27th. The details will be posted on the SCC website in the coming days, and I hope to see many of you there. The recording and the slides will be posted on the website as well. And again, with that, thank you all for your time today, and especially Becki for this great look at change management.
Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity. And I welcome anyone to contact me, and I've put my email here.
Very good. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.